Okay, let me. You can feel free to unmute and talk while we wait for people. You don't have to just wave in silence.
It was fun to wave though, because you don't know who you're getting.
Yes, that works.
Hi, Norma.
Hi, I thought you were waving to me.
Everybody.
I was waving to you, and I was waving to you. I waved to everybody on my screen.
Okay.
Bonnie, everybody, all the way across.
Okay, I'm waving to everybody too. Now that I put the lights on and I could see myself and I could see other people.
Good.
But I'm also finishing my dessert.
Well, good for you. So how's everything, Norma?
Same as usual.
Did you get to see your daughter yet?
No,
No.
they're having their second shots tomorrow.
Good.
So maybe we'll see them in June. Who knows?
You don't have to wait that long. Only a
I'm
couple
ready to get on our TV, on our computer. What's she doing there?
She's coughing. That's what she's doing there.
a lot of dust. The dust around. I've been packing. So,
Mazel tov with your house.
pardon me?
Mazel tov on selling your house. I hope you find
Third time is a
another
charm.
one quickly.
Yeah, and quickly. Yes. Thank you. Now I have nowhere to live.
We have an extra
You
bedroom.
know where you're gonna
Do you?
move to.
Or you can sleep out on our porch. It's getting warm.
Thank you. That's very sweet of you. I won't take you up on it though. I've got to find something.
You better hurry up because we rent these rooms out pretty quickly.
Yeah, there. Somebody else told me that she's renting her, what was she said, her 1-bedroom basement. I said, oh, I think that's a little small.
Maybe she has a big basement. It might be a
No,
big.
she said it's small, so I figured, yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. I haven't shopped for an apartment and since we moved here and moved to Asheville at first, and they're a whole lot different. They're like 3 times the price almost.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then it's
Are you
hard.
concentrating in North Raleigh for your
No.
apartment?
No, anywhere around. Yeah, it's tough, but yeah. And if you want a shorter lease, a short-term lease, it's even more expensive.
Yes.
Is that
You can
me?
move into a hotel.
Pardon me? A
Get a room
hotel?
in a hotel.
Well, they have those furnished hotel kind of things.
Right.
You charge a fortune and it goes by the night price.
Does it? Because we know somebody who's lived in a hotel for 3 years up near Crabtree.
Has been
At
living there.
least 3 years.
Which one? Which apartment?
No, a hotel, the one on the hill across from Crabtree.
Marriott or the Embassy Suite?
No, no.
Not the Marriott, on what's that, Blue Ridge Road? Ridge Road.
No, it's not.
Ridge Road. Blue Ridge.
No, it's not even Blue Ridge Road.
They used to have executive suites and apartment complexes too, that they
Yeah.
rented.
What? Okay, I'm giving over to Paul. I have to go get the phone. No, yeah, it's a long story. Yeah, here's Paul. He's gonna take over. I gotta get.
All right, well, this is a good time. We're
Anybody
gonna get
beside us
started.
have a problem with the volume?
So basically, this is a pre-recorded presentation that was given to Bethel in Durham, and they have graciously offered to us to use it as
Oh.
well. The presentation is an hour long, and then they did a Q&A for 30 minutes after with the 2 Nobel laureates. So since they can't be with us to answer the questions, I thought I would just play it through. If you find the questions that they ask interesting, you can hear their answers. But if you're, ready to go after the 1 hour mark, feel free to sign off. I understand that it's long and it's hard when you can't interact with the video. And it starts out like in the full view screens where you can see, all of their community members. But then when the presentation starts, it does, show just the speaker and their PowerPoint. So for the first minute, it's everyone, but don't think that's the whole thing. So I will share my, and I will share my sound so you can see it.
So first, we're going to hear from Dr. Ray Greenberg
And then we're going to hear from Dr. Bob Lefkowitz. I will say Dr. Ray Greenberg has written a book called Medal Winners: How the Vietnam War Launched Nobel Careers. It's a discussion of how newly minted physicians during the Vietnam War, one of their few alternatives to military service was the Clinical Associate Training Program at the National Institutes of Health. It was an elite program that launched an unprecedented number of remarkable scientific careers that would revolutionize medicine at the end of the 20th century. Dr. Greenberg is the special advisor to the Office of Health Affairs for the University of Texas System. He provides leadership and operational support to the Office of Health Affairs. He joined the University of Texas Medical System in 2013 as the Executive Vice Chancellor for Health Affairs and served in that capacity until March 2019, providing oversight and guidance for the six UT health systems, for the six UT system health institutions, one of the largest networks of academic health institutions in the country. He served for 13 years as the president of the Medical University of South Carolina, and before that, 5 years as the vice president for academic affairs and a provost there. And during that time, the Medical University of South Carolina became a National Cancer Institute designated cancer center and received a National Institutes of Health Clinical and Translational Science Award. Dr. Greenberg served for 12 years at Emory University, where he's the chair of the medical school's Department of Epidemiology and Biostatistics, deputy director of the Winship Cancer Center, and founding dean of the Rollins School of Public Health. He, importantly for this group, went to UNC as an undergraduate and then earned a medical degree from Duke University, a master's degree in public health from Harvard, a doctorate in epidemiology from the University of North Carolina. And he also holds honorary degrees from the College of Charleston, Simpson College, and the Citadel. He is nationally recognized for his research on cancer and has served on many scientific advisory boards. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Greenberg, and then when he finishes, I'll do my best to introduce Bob as well. But let me turn it over to you, Ray.
Well, thank you very much, Rabbi. I'm happy to see your mother here, and she may be the most important person on the group, but I can raise you one. I've got my sister and my brother from Israel. I saw on the list, so I've got two relatives to your one, but still, obviously, yours is more important. Okay, let's see how technically incompetent I am, if I can share my screen. Remarkably enough. Okay, so first of all, what a thrill to, number one, give a talk jointly with Bob Lefkowitz, and number two, to have a nostalgic trip back to Bethel Synagogue, where I was raised. And this is for those who doubt the authenticity of my Bethel connections. This is a slide that my sister sent to me the other day. She says it was taken at my brother's confirmation. That's him in the back row on the left. Next to him is my mother, Ruth.
Ray, I think you should advance it one slide because we're just seeing the title slide.
Oh, it's advanced on my screen, huh? Wonder.
Try hitting slideshow start from beginning. And if not, I can jump in and do mine.
It may be going. Okay. Slideshow from beginning.
Yep. There you go.
Now is it advancing?
Yeah, we see two slides, but yes.
Okay. I'm not sure what the what I can do about this. So you can see the one of the family.
Yes.
Okay, so that's my sister Frances. Next to me, I'm the little tyke there, dressed like intending to be a lawyer, I think. I don't know what the little outfit was, but this is, I don't know the exact date. Stan may remember what year it would be, but this must be around 1965 or so. My father, Bernie, former president of the synagogue, standing behind me, and Ruth, my mother, who is still alive, turned 99 in December and lives near my sister in Wilmington, Delaware. Okay, is it advancing now, Rabbi? Okay, so the Rabbi mentioned this book. For all of you who have not yet purchased a copy of this book, it is still available on Amazon. It's, I think all 7 people who've read it gave it a good review. But this was, the reason I mention this is because it's sort of how I got into this topic. I read a paper that was published in Science in 2012, published by 2 colleagues from the University of Texas System, Joe Goldstein and Michael Brown. And they wrote about a program at the National Institutes of Health that existed during both the Korean and the Vietnam War. That was basically one of the few ways, if you were a male physician during those wars, completely separate from the regular draft, there was a special doctor draft. And one of the few ways to serve the country as an alternative to that was the National Institutes of Health. The Centers for Disease Control was another alternative. Because there were about 7,000 medical school graduates each year, and there were only about 200 positions at the NIH, it was an extremely competitive program to get into. You really had to be at the very top of your medical school class to get into it. And as a consequence, the program really selected the best and brightest rising stars in the field of medicine. And there were, as this article in Science pointed out, there were 9 at the time members of this program that ultimately went on to win Nobel Prizes, including Goldstein and Brown. It turns out 4 of those 9, almost half of them, came in one particular year, 1968, which of course, for those of us who remember that year, was kind of a horrible year in the country with the Vietnam War and the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy, the horrendous Chicago Democratic Convention. It was just a very turbulent time. But on the NIH campus in Bethesda, these young physicians were beginning to get exposed to science, which would lead to extraordinary careers. And these are the 4 that I wrote about. On the left, I hope you can see there are two sets of a lot of white coat people. On the left is the internship class from Massachusetts General Hospital, 1966, and circled in there are Joe Goldstein from, by the way, a little teeny town in South Carolina, Kingstree, South Carolina, and Michael Brown, who is a few rows down and to his right. And then the slide on the right, not to be outdone, is the internship group from the Columbia Presbyterian Hospital, another of the most prestigious hospitals in the country, same year. And there are two individuals noted there, Varmus, Harold Varmus in the background, and our own Bob Lefkowitz sitting at the end of the front row on the left. Now, so those 4 are the folks that I wrote about, and an important part of their training at NIH was the mentorship that they received from outstanding scientists there. And starting on the left, Marshall Nirenberg, who won the Nobel Prize actually a few months after this group arrived at the NIH for breaking the genetic code. He was one of 3 co-recipients for that. He was the mentor to Joe Goldstein. The mentor for Mike Brown is this fellow Earl Stotman, who was known kind of as the biochemist. He did important enzyme work in bacteria. On the top is Ira Paston, Ira was the mentor to 2 of the 4. He was one of the co-mentors to Bob, as well as to Harold Varmus. And finally, Jesse Roth, another endocrinologist, was a co-mentor to Bob. And when I started doing this, suddenly a light bulb went off for me that perhaps should have gone off long before that. But in this sample, which isn't a random sample, but in this small sample that I chose, all 4 of the future Nobel laureates were Jewish, and 3 of the 4 mentors for these Nobel laureates were Jewish. And of course, this was hardly a brand new discovery on my part, that there's a strong association between Jews and the Nobel Prize. There are nearly 1,000 through last year, nearly 1,000 Nobel Prize winners since the award was created in 1901. And of those, 23% of the recipients have been Jewish. And of the 333 American winners since 1950, 36% of them were Jews. So, one kind of perspective on this is, what would we expect as kind of the background percentage? Well, I'm sorry. Let's just look at, these are the different categories of the Nobel Prize. And it's kind of interesting that there are large numbers in all the categories, but economics, nearly 40% of the recipients of economics Nobel Prizes have been Jewish. In physiology or medicine, over about 1/3 have been Jewish. In physics, over 1/4. In chemistry, almost 1/5. And then lower percentages in literature and peace. Apparently, we aren't as good at making peace as we are doing science. And just as a perspective, how would you put this, 25 to 30% in perspective to the representation of the general population? Jews, as you I'm sure recognize, are roughly 2% of the US population. And in the world population, they're about 2.2%. So obviously there's something like a more than 10-fold increase in the likelihood that someone of Jewish descent would win a Nobel Prize as compared to others. So this raises a kind of a fundamental question. Why are there so many Jews that have won Nobel Prizes? And there are kind of 2 leading explanations. The yin and the yang here is it's either nature, it's all in the genes, or it's nurture, the way Jews raise their children and the values that they instill. So let me talk briefly about those 2 kind of theories, starting with the upbringing. The kind of the classical things that are said with regard to this is that Jews have historically had an emphasis on education. They classically are known for their love of debate, and this famous painting is kind of an illustration of a bunch of rebbes sitting around, probably discussing Talmudic issues. And importantly, Jews have, for most of the last millennium or more, have been kind of outside the mainstream. So they kind of think differently than the status quo, which is very important, as I'm sure Bob would attest, in thinking about and doing really innovative work in science. You have to look at things differently than the majority of folks. So quickly on the genetic hypothesis, the people that argue for this point out that Ashkenazi Jews on average score higher on intelligence tests than non-Jews. And this has been repeatedly seen in a number of settings where they score 1 to 1.5 standard deviations above the general population. So scores typically found in the 110 to 115 range. There's lots of work that's now been done with whole genome sequencing to suggest that genes are strongly related to intelligence. There are more than 1,000 genes that have been linked in some way to intelligence. And Ashkenazi Jews, it's not surprising to talk about Jews and genetic factors, because we know that Jews are distinguished in a number of ways genetically from other populations. And this is one thing that I didn't know until I started reading about this, that about 30 generations ago, Ashkenazi Jews, the total population in the world was reduced to around 350 people through pogroms and all sorts of other disasters that befell them. And I had no idea that it fell to such a small number. And when you get a population that arises from such a small number of people, that limits the genetic diversity. And then when you get a lot of intermarrying and breeding in between, that brings out recessive traits in that population. So I think probably everybody on this knows the famous genetic associations of Jews with Tay-Sachs disease and Gaucher's disease, the unfortunate parts of this small genetic diversity. You know, there's some other things that have been thought to bring out these Jewish intellectual traits. Jews were limited in the kinds of occupations that they could have in Europe for many centuries, money lending and the mercantile trades, both of which required strong quantitative skills. It's also been pointed out that Jews in money lending and merchants probably had to have multilingual abilities, not only Hebrew and Yiddish, but also the native tongues of the people that they were having commerce with. Certainly, the Jewish tradition has venerated male scholars, and often the arranged marriages favored the scholars marrying with some of the most gifted young women in the community. And in times of persecution, those who survived probably did so on the basis of intelligence and resources, or a combination of both. But beyond those two, the genetics and the upbringing, I'd like to talk about what I think is probably as important, if not the most important explanation for what we've seen, which really has to do with immigrants. And it's not an exclusively Jewish phenomenon. We see it in a lot of immigrant communities that the first and second generation children, when they suddenly have new opportunities, flourish in a way that their parents and grandparents never had an opportunity to. And this can really be seen. There are some studies that have looked at intelligence testing results between World War I, when the first kind of wave of Jewish immigrants and Jewish children, to the next generation, World War II, dramatic increase in performance on intelligence tests. And in fact, during World War I, the early testing showed that Jews had relatively low intelligence, and they were sort of called out as being sort of from a lower breed, if you will. There's no way that genetics can change that kind of performance in one generation. That really is got to be related to social and environmental changes. And you know what I think really drove this is that this was the way to make it in society, in the new culture in America, was through education. And that's what drove this first and second generation to be so successful. And you can see this if you look at the Jewish Nobel, the percentage of American Nobel laureates who were Jewish in these categories, you know, is as much as almost 90% of those in economics, slightly lower percentages, but still dramatic in physics and chemistry and physiology or medicine. Now, what is not recognized nearly as much, has not been written about, is the fact that this phenomenon is trailing off. It kind of peaked, if you will, if you look at 30-year segments of the Nobel Prizes, it peaked in the late 20th century, where about a third of the recipients in science were Jewish. And then it started to decline as we move past the first and second generations. And this is true pretty much across the board. If you look at physiology and medicine, it's been about a 40% decline since the peak in the 1980s. Similarly, about a 40% decline in chemistry since the 1980s, and even larger decline in economics, where the peak was a little bit later in the 1990s. Now, you have to remember that there's a bit of a lag between the time of the key work that someone did that is recognized in the Nobel and when the award is actually made. And just to pick some examples here. I looked at those who won the award in the 1970s and then went back to their kind of the body of the key work that led to the prize. And you can see it was a little bit shorter in physiology or medicine, it was about a dozen years. But in physics, chemistry, and economics, you're talking about work that generally was started a quarter century or so earlier. This is an example of relatively fast recognition. Joe Goldstein and Mike Brown, who I talked about in Medal Winners, colleagues of Bob Lefkowitz, they started their work together in 1972. By the way, they're still working together. It's the longest sustained working relationship. There aren't many marriages that have lasted more than 50 years. These guys are still working together, still doing lab work, just like Bob and Harold are. And they were the fastest of this quartet to their Nobel Prize, which was awarded in 1985. So the phenomenon, the kind of peak of education leading to the late 20th century Nobel Prize excess we're now past that peak. And today, Jewish young people have many more career options than going into science or medicine. So if you were going into those fields, and a little, perhaps biased survey of the 9 children of the 4 Nobel laureates that I wrote about, only one of them, one of Mike Brown's daughters, has gone into medicine. Bob and Arna produced 5 of the 9, and they've all gone into interesting careers, but none of them in physiology, medicine, or science. And so the question is, have we come to the end, or are we approaching the end of the Jewish Nobel Association? And with that, I will turn it over to Robert.
Thank you, Ray, for a fascinating presentation. And we put a link in the chat where you can purchase the book on Amazon, and I encourage everyone to do so. And it is now going to be a pleasure for me to introduce Dr. and Professor Bob Lefkowitz. I want to say, well, I'm going to do my best with the professional pieces. So he, for our purposes today, most importantly, is the author of a new book, and we will put the information about that into the chat. It's called "A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to Stockholm," recounting his early career as a cardiologist and transition to biochemistry, which led to his Nobel Prize win. He is the James B. Duke Professor of Medicine and Professor of Biochemistry and Chemistry at the Duke University Medical Center, and has been an investigator of the Howard Hughes Medical Institute since 1976. And I am going to let go of trying to describe in too much detail that for which he achieved the Nobel Prize, because there are many people on this call who can do it better than I. I will only read a little portion of what's on the Nobel site, which is that he discovered an entire family of receptors that look and act in similar ways. G protein coupled receptors. Approximately half of all medications used today make use of this receptor. He's won pretty much every award, the National Medal of Science, the Shaw Prize, the Albany Prize, and of course the 2012 Nobel Prize in Chemistry. And he was elected to the USA National Academy of Sciences in 1988, and the Institute of Medicine in 1994, and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 1988. Related to Ray's presentation, if you go to the Nobel site, when Bob describes his origins, I'm going to read to you just a little, a little bit of what he says. He says, I share 2 attributes with 33 other Nobel laureates. We are Jewish, and we were educated in New York City public high schools. And I will say, Bob, you've got many people giving you a shout out for the Bronx High School of Science. Some very proud people on this call. And you wrote, the overwhelming majority of this group descended from Eastern European Jews who came to America between 1881 and 1924 during the Great Migration. And Bob writes, in my case, this was true of all four of my grandparents. My paternal grandparents, Mary Kremsdorf, Louis Lefkowitz, were from two nearby towns in southeast Poland, Czechoslovakia and Zoloshin, forgive me. They were already married with one child when they emigrated to the United States in 1903, initially settling on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, and they would live their entire lives in New York City, primarily in the Bronx, and raised 7 children, the second oldest of whom was my father, Max, of blessed memory. And my grandfather was a cap maker and grandmother a homemaker. That biography, so common as was said. I just want to say that Bob is a treasured friend, a treasured student, a treasured member of Bethel. And I had so much fun and was so honored when he won the Nobel Prize. I called him and I said, we'd like to give you a Misha Berach. And then I reached out to my colleagues and I said, does anybody have a Misha Berach that they gave to a Nobel Prize winner? Because there aren't that many of them. And but we figured something out and gave him a blessing and are glad to welcome you to talk about your book. Go ahead.
Okay, well, thank you very, very much, Rebbe. Let me see if I can share my screen. Can you see my slides up here?
We can.
Okay, I'm
It
going to
doesn't
go.
look like the slideshow is on, so you may need
Yeah,
to.
I'm going to do that. Okay. How's that?
Perfect.
Okay, great. Well, delighted to be here, everyone, to share a few of my stories. So when I talk about my career, most often to young students, I often call it a tale of two callings. I guess we all have an intuitive sense of what we mean by a calling, sort of a sense of destiny that you were called to do a specific thing. We generally associate that, I think, primarily with clergy, like the Rebbe. But you can feel a calling to all manner of activities. And in my case, although I didn't appreciate it because I was too young at the time, there is no doubt that I, early in my life, felt a calling to the practice of medicine, which was very clarifying for me as I was growing up. And subsequently would feel a calling to become a scientist. As the Rebbe mentioned, I have a book which coincidentally is going to be published on Tuesday. And I'm hoping that it might be of interest to many in the group today. I show this picture of me as a, I don't know, 7-year-old, 6-year-old, something like that. Not just because I was an ardent Yankee fan at this point in my life growing up in the Bronx, but to remind me that it was at about this age, probably about 7 years of age, that I first conceived the notion that I would become a physician. And I never wavered from that. The impetus to this was very clear in my mind, was my family physician, a Jewish physician, Dr. Joseph Feibush, who was engaged in the general practice of medicine and internal medicine in the Bronx, where I grew up, and who made house calls. And I was absolutely captivated by him, the fact that he had special knowledge, things that the rest of us didn't know, my parents didn't know, and that he could apply this special knowledge to heal people, to make them feel better. And to me, it seemed clear that there was just nothing else as important, as valuable to do. And so from this age on, there was no doubt in my mind that I would become a doctor someday. The other thing about my childhood, which I think is relevant to the presentation that Ray made, is this issue of nurture, because I grew up in a home where reading was prized, and I was a precocious reader. In fact, I remember when I was a little older than this, maybe 10, I used to trick my parents into joining book clubs like the Reader's Digest book club or the Literary Guild, which were advertised in the New York Times book review section. I would clip out coupons, send them in so that my parents were now members of the club without their knowing about this. And this would entitle me, us actually, to obtain certain sets of books free of charge, as long as a contract was honored where the family would buy 3 or 4 more books at price over the next year. And in this way, I acquired, I remember, Winston Churchill's 6-volume History of the Second World War and Carl Sandburg's 5-volume biography of Lincoln, and I'd read both sets by the time I was 12. Now, while Ray was speaking, I was actually fiddling with my talk, and I added this slide. So, and again, this has to do with the issue of nurture. This was a slide I put together for a roast a number of years back, where I was roasting Joe Goldstein. Now, I put it in there because, as you heard, Joe, also of Jewish extraction, grew up in a tiny town in King Street, South Carolina. And I grew up on the asphalt jungles of the Bronx. But look at these 2 photographs. I mean, you can see how similar our playthings were. And I guess this is what kids growing up in the early 1950s were doing. Now, you heard about the Bronx High School of Science. It seemed natural that I would attend the Bronx High School of Science. This is an amazing public high school, admission to which is determined by a competitive examination. There are no other criteria for admission. In my day, I was class of 59, the school was about 90% Jewish, absolutely remarkable. And you can draw your own conclusions as to why it was 90% Jewish. Today, there's a totally different demographic. I've been back several times recently. In fact, spoke to the school virtually last week. But today, it's about 80% Asian American. This remarkable high school has graduated 8 future Nobel laureates, of which I am the most recent. I am the 8th. Not surprisingly, given what I just told you, all 8 are Jewish. So that's a remarkable statistic. To put it in some context, consider this. If the Bronx High School of Science were a country and not a high school, there would be only 19 countries in the world that would have more Nobel laureates than this one high school. Well, from the Bronx High School of Science, of course, I went on to Columbia College, where I majored in chemistry, and then to Columbia's Medical School, the College of Physicians and Surgeons in New York. This is a picture of me at my graduation from medical school. And one of the things that often brings a tear to my eye when I look at this photograph shows my mom and dad. My dad died young. He was only 63, died of his 4th heart attack only 2 years after I graduated medical school. But he told me, as well as several other relatives at this time, that my graduation from medical school was the proudest day of his life. And I can't tell you how many times I've looked back on this and said to myself, if this was the proudest day of his life, what might he have thought about some of the things that happened to me subsequently? In any case, maybe at some level, he knows. I became a house officer, an intern and a resident at Columbia Presbyterian Medical School. As you heard, that cursor is on me. And would have gone on happily to a career as a practicing internist and cardiologist, which was really all that I was dreaming of up to this point, except, as Ray pointed out, for a generationally defining event, the Vietnam War. And Ray has told you a little bit about this. It was, of course, for those of you who are old enough to remember, an extraordinarily unhappy time. It was an unpopular war. Many of us felt it was an illegal war. There were demonstrations. There were even riots. and there was a draft. For all men over 18, there was a lottery draft. That meant you either, whether you went in or you didn't go in, depended on the number that you got. But for physicians, there was no lottery. There was something called the doctor draft, which stated that following your internship or a period of residency training, doctors were inducted for 2 years of service in the armed forces, potentially disrupting their plans to begin clinical residency or continued education and training toward a research career. Well, it was a very unpopular war. Once you were drafted, which meant everybody, you spent 2 years in the service and one of those in Vietnam. There were very, very few ways around that. One way around that fate was to be drafted into the United States Public Health Service, which was considered one of the military branches. If you were drafted into the USPHS, then you had a chance of spending your 2 years stateside in one of their research establishments, such as the National Institutes of Health and the CDC, the Communicable Disease Center. Well, you can imagine how competitive it was to get into that program. Only the best and the brightest could make it in. And of course, because everybody wanted it. And so they really did get an amazing cadre of individuals. I was fortunate enough, because of my high academic standing and good recommendations, to gain such a commission. And so in 1968, right out of my residency, I was ordered to the NIH as a lieutenant commander in the United States Public Health Service. This slide shows some of my group. Typically each year, about 50 to 75 young men, and we of course were all men because this was a military draft, went to the NIH. And this shows some of us in our photograph that year. And interestingly, in this photograph are 3 of the 4 Nobelists that Ray devotes his wonderful book, Medal Winners, to. Here's Harold Varmus, who was a medical school classmate of mine, myself, and Michael Brown. The only one we're missing is Joe Goldstein. This was a picture of the National Institutes of Arthritis and Metabolic Diseases staff. Joe is in the Heart Institute, and so he doesn't show up in this picture. Oh, and by the way, one other member of this class of 1968 at the NIH, who you may have heard of, Tony Fauci. So it was a pretty good group. Let me say that my time at the NIH was largely miserable. I had never tried to do research before. I never had particularly wanted to do research before. My interests were only clinical. In fact, I had avoided all opportunities up to this point in medical school and college to do research. And it showed, because I failed miserably for the first 18 of the 24 months that I was there. And I hated it because I had never failed at anything in a sustained way before in my life. And so this was very tough to take. But fortunately, thanks be God, in my final 6 months at the NIH, I met with some success. I published my first 3 scientific papers and began to get a taste of just how exciting it could be to begin to make little discoveries. My mentors, as you heard, both of whom were Jewish, basically implored me to stay on for additional time at the NIH. But although I was beginning to enjoy the research, I was far from convinced. I had already made arrangements, especially the year before when I was so unhappy there. I had already made arrangements to move with my family to Boston to take up residency and fellowship training in medicine and cardiology so I could go on to the career as a clinical practitioner that I had dreamed of. This is a picture of me in what I sometimes call my rabbi photograph because I have a beard. I don't know why I associate beards with rabbis. You can see that this would have been about 1970 or 71. You can see the style and ties was rather different perhaps than it is today. It was while I was at the Massachusetts General Hospital as a senior resident in medicine that I had my true epiphany in my career. Because in the first 6 months, I threw myself into the clinical work. with gusto. I always loved clinical medicine. If I do say so myself, I was pretty good at it at that time. And I was really enjoying the intense clinical work that I was doing. But I really sensed that something was missing. And by the time those first 6 months ended, it had become clear to me, through the absence of being in the laboratory, that I needed to include some form of research in my future career. I was hardly experiencing it yet as a calling, but it was clearly something that I felt needed to be part of my career. And so in 1973, I moved with my family to Durham, North Carolina, to take up a position as a young faculty member at Duke University Medical School. They had made an effort to recruit me away from Harvard, where I thought I would be staying because I had been offered an assistant professorship there. But they had seen some of my early papers that I began to publish from the Mass General. What had happened was that after those first 6 months, when I realized that I needed to start doing research again, I sought out another mentor, a man named Edgar Haber, who was chief of the cardiology division and a very well-known immunochemist. And I asked if I could begin working part-time in his laboratory. He was more than happy to have me. And so for the remaining 2.5 years at the Mass General, I split my time between doing research and finishing my clinical training. I can't say that I made all that much progress while I was at the Mass General, but I did publish a few papers. They caught the attention of the chief of cardiology and the chair of medicine at Duke. And so they made an effort to recruit me. They were very anxious to recruit me to start a program in so-called molecular cardiology, a field that didn't really exist at that time. And so they were successful in recruiting me to Duke in 1973, where I split my time between being a physician, making rounds in both cardiology and internal medicine and doing consultations, and starting my laboratory, here shown with some of my earliest trainees. I would point out that the percentage of time that I spent in these two different activities would evolve dramatically over my first few years. I would say during 1973 and 1974, I probably spent as much as 40% of my time doing clinical work, maybe 60% in the lab. But over the next few years, as the research program ramped up and we began making a series of what would turn out to be important discoveries, I spent more and more time in the laboratory. Eventually, I would say fairly quickly, within about 5 years, I was spending about 80% of my time in the lab. Not because I had actually decided at any cognitive level to do that, it just sort of happened. I found myself in spare moments, whether on the way home from work or in the shower, dreaming about my experiments more than I was about the interesting patient I might have seen in clinic. And so I eventually got to a point where I was spending 80 to 90% of the time in the lab, and that continued really until about 10 years ago when I gave up clinical practice altogether, and subsequently have been essentially 100% in the laboratory. I'm not going to talk about my research at all today, but the rabbi actually told you what you need to know, which is shown on this slide, which is that I discovered a family of receptors, that is molecules on cells, to which drugs interact, much like a key fitting into a lock. In that analogy, the receptors are the lock and the drugs are the keys. In any case, anywhere from 30 to 50% of all drugs that are FDA approved today, that's about 700 drugs, are drugs which now target the family of receptors that we discovered, which is very gratifying, as you can imagine. It's worth pointing out that my research has always been very basic or fundamental research. It was never intended to discover a drug, develop a new treatment, cure a disease, or any of those things. It was basically driven by curiosity and trying to understand how drugs and hormones work. But in the end, as so often the case with basic research, it has had a very significant impact on clinical practice. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the family that I have mentioned several points up to now, which have been busy moving around from New York to Bethesda and down to the NIH, down to Duke. When we came in 1973, we had 4 children, and the youngest, Josh, was born while we were here. This is my first wife, Arna, with whom I keep in close touch, who I think I saw is listening to the talk today. My eldest, David, Larry, now known as Noah Jordan, Cheryl, Mara, and the baby Josh, and that's me in the back row. Now, I have had, as you can imagine, a number of just remarkable experiences in my career, and I've gotten to meet some amazing people. Some of you may recognize the guy sitting to my right. That's Tony Fauci. Tony and I became close friends at the NIH and have been close friends to this day. I've been in touch with him on multiple occasions during the pandemic, mainly just offering moral support. We both served on the council of an academic organization called the Association of American Physicians. We served together on the council for 10 years. And this shows Tony sitting to my right at a council meeting. I have several, I think, entertaining stories about Tony in the book. I've gotten to meet 2 presidents. I met George Bush in 2008 when I won the National Medal of Science. It was an interesting experience because I was never a fan of President Bush and disagreed with many of his policies. But getting the opportunity to spend a few minutes alone with him at this time, I formed a much different impression of him as a very cordial and warm and sincere human being. But I must admit, I was happier to meet President Obama. So it's a long-standing tradition that the President of the United States greets all the American Nobel laureates when they're on their way to Stockholm to accept the prize. You won't be surprised to hear that long tradition was broken by President Trump, who never met with any of the Nobel laureates, several of whom said that had they been invited, they wouldn't have gone. Anyway, the 5 of us and our spouses had the opportunity to spend a very nice visit with President Obama in the Oval Office. He was very warm. You know, they talk about him as being comfortable in his own skin, and I think that really does describe it. You can see the warm smile he was giving me as we left. He was very entertaining. I must say, he's got a wonderful sense of humor. As we were talking with him, he said, you know, I really feel a certain sense of kinship with you laureates, because he says, as you may know, I too won a Nobel Prize. And I'm sure many of you in the audience today remember that in his very first year of office, he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. Anyway, he says, I feel a sense of kinship with you because like you folks, I too am a Nobel laureate. And then he paused and he said, but there is one key difference. He says, you earned yours, which was kind of cute. The reason he's smiling at me here is I was telling him that I was a big fan of his wife, Michelle. And he said, why don't you get in line on that? Anyway, it was very cute. I had a remarkable experience at Cameron Indoor Stadium shortly after I got word that I was to be that year's Nobel laureate in chemistry. I got a call 2 days later. This would have been I guess in October, from Coach K, whom up to that point I had not known personally. And he was very warm. We chatted for probably at least 20 minutes. And he said, Bob, he says, you know, I really feel an affinity for you, even though we've not met. He said, as you may recall, I brought Duke our very first NCAA men's basketball championship, and now you've brought the university its very first Nobel Prize. And so I'd like to bring you down to Cameron Indoor Stadium next week for what's called Countdown to Madness, I think, which is the opening practice of the season. To honor you, I said, well, what do you have in mind? He says, well, you'll find out when you get there. So I went down with my wife and a few of my trainees who were big fans, and to a packed house, which you can see their hands up behind me there. They presented me with my own jersey, my own #1, and it was a remarkable experience. So then they put the jersey on me, and then they all retreated from center court, and I started to follow them. I've never felt so short in my life, and I'm 6 feet tall. And Coach K waved me back. He said, no, I want you to stand here and just soak it up. So I did, and I actually lifted my arms in the air, and I could hear the students just roaring something at me. The Duke students, some of you who go to the games may know, are sort of famous for pointing at players and chanting things at them in unison. Typically, it's when an opposition player is fouling out of a game. In this case, though, I could see them pointing at me in unison and chanting something which I could not quite make out. And then finally, it came into focus. They were chanting in unison, "He's so smart. He's so smart." Well, as you can imagine, that was pretty much of a buzz, and I got a real kick out of it. There is a follow-up to this story. This was in 2012. In 2015, 3 years later, Coach and his team win their 5th NCAA championship. And the whole team is invited up to celebrate with President Obama, who was a huge college basketball fan, and in particular a Duke fan. And so they went up there, the team and the coach, the president of the university. A day or two later, a picture appears in the Duke Chronicle, the student newspaper, showing the coach presenting Obama with a jersey very similar to the one you see here with his name, and to my horror, the #1 on it. That's my number. Now, those of you who've been to Cameron Stadium know that when they retire the number of a very distinguished star athlete on the team, they make a huge copy of it and they hang it from the rafters. So inspired by that, when I got this jersey, rather than ever wearing it, I hung it from the rafters in my office. To this day, it hangs from the ceiling in my office. So I took a picture of this, of the jersey hanging in my office, and I immediately, because by that point, I had become quite good friends with the coach, and I immediately texted it to him. And I said, "Coach, what are you doing?" I said, "That's my number. It's #1. It's retired. As you can see from this photo, it's hanging from the rafters in my office." Within an hour, he writes me back. He says, "Bob, I'm so apologetic." He says, "I really didn't want to do it. But what are we going to do? It's the president of the United States. I had to do it." He says, "But look," he says, "you know, and I know, you're the real #1. So once he said that, what could I say? I wrote back, I said, "Coach, all is forgiven." Of course, I got to meet the coach. I'm sorry, the coach. I got to meet the King of Sweden. And that whole Nobel Week thing is, again, I have a chapter or 2 on that in the book. And basically all the stories I've been telling you are in the book and many, many more. But this week of Nobel Week, you could write an entire book about that. And then here was a crazy experience I had. I was invited to be honored by throwing out the first pitch at a Durham Bulls game. This shows me with team mascot Wooly Bull, Victor Zhao holding the bat, who was at the time the CEO of Duke Medical Center, and the mayor of Durham at the time, Bill Bell. And you can see the Jumbotron behind us. In the book, you can read about the story. I was originally invited to throw out the first pitch at a New York Yankees game, which was really a fantasy. But at the last minute, I was bumped by Rudy Giuliani. But if you want to know the details, you'll have to read the book. In any case, I practiced for 2 months before throwing out the first pitch here. And it's a good thing that I did practice because it was not pretty at the beginning. But I got pretty good. I was coached by my granddaughter, Maya, who played a lot of softball. And I'm proud to say that when I went out there, I confidently threw a strike. And for those of you who want to verify that for yourself, just go to YouTube, put in my name, and put my name, first pitch, and you can see that strike that I threw. I tell people it was my changeup. It was probably about 30 miles an hour, but it was in fact a strike.
In case it doesn't make it into the book, I'll just interrupt. When you talked about meeting the king, you were also equipped from Bethel with the text of the special blessing that you meet when meeting the king.
Indeed, and I still have a copy of that blessing. And speaking of Nobel Week, as I say, it would take me a week to tell you all the stories I've got in the book, but there's a very interesting and I think amusing story of how my now son-in-law proposed to my daughter, Mara, literally right after the Nobel ceremony and in front of 1,000 people, including the king. You'll also have to read the book to understand why these two gentlemen on the right, I can't hear people obviously, but take a minute, see if you recognize these people. That is Sting on the right and Peter Gabriel on the left in a faux showing of deep respect and honor for me. But you'll have to read the book to see why in fact they're doing that. Okay, this is my basically my last slide, and I want to bring it back to Ray's wonderful discussion of the chosen people of the Nobel Prize. So I mentioned the amazing outpouring of Nobel laureates from this group of public health service officers who went to the NIH during the Vietnam War. We were called initially derisively, but then as a mark of respect, we would often refer to as the Yellow Berets. Obviously a takeoff on the Green Berets, our elite commando forces, and yellow for cowardice. But for most of us, not serving in Vietnam had nothing to do with our bravery or lack thereof or its presence. Rather, it had to do with our moral objection to a war that we felt was immoral and illegal. In any case, the Yellow Berets put forth a remarkable outpouring of scientists. And I am far from the only Yellow Beret in the congregation. I'm sure there are a good number, given the number of people from the medical centers in the congregation. But just to mention two others, my buddies Ralph Snyderman and Harvey Cohn were both Yellow Berets. In any case, this slide shows the following. In this yellow banner here are the names of 9 individuals, including myself, who served in the Yellow Berets during the peak years of the Vietnam War, in this case between 64 and 72, and who went on to win the Nobel Prize. So there are 9 of us there. There are now actually 10, because Harvey Alter won last year for the discovery of hepatitis C. So there are actually 10 of us from that period who won the Nobel Prize, and we're all colored in blue. Of those 10, 8 of us are Jewish. Now, this is a scientific family tree which shows our various mentors and their mentors going back for generations and generations. Notice immediately that about half of these folks actually have as one of their mentors a Nobel laureate. So about half of these people trained with a Nobel laureate. For the rest of us, you don't have to go, take me for example, you don't have to go any further back than a scientific grandparent. In my case, I have 2 scientific grandparents who were Nobel laureates. And that's true for all the others as well. Now, everybody colored blue here is a Nobel laureate. And if you go back, you can see that a remarkable number of Nobel laureates are in the lineages of these Nobel laureates. This simply confirms what all scientists know, and I'm sure it's not unique to science, which is that there are remarkable lineages in science. If you look at the careers of scientists who have distinguished themselves or made important discoveries, almost invariably, They have trained with scientists who have made important discoveries, and back and back and back. And there's tremendous cross-fertilization here. Notice that, for example, in my lineage, you eventually get back to 2 Nobel Prize-winning physicists, Erwin Schrödinger, James Chadwick, also Lisa Meitner, who should have shared the prize but didn't, etc. So I think what this confirms is something which I'm sure is true in many occupations and professions, which is the importance of mentoring, but that's a whole separate subject. I want to point out, coming back to Ray's point, that of our group here, 8 out of 10, 80% were Jewish. In these lineages here, about 55% of these Nobel laureates are Jewish. But so far, and this is a very small sample, only 3 Nobel laureates have come from these 9 or 10 Yellow Beret laureates. And they're shown here. One of them is from me, Brian Kobilka, with whom I shared the prize. None of these are Jewish. Now, whether that, speaks to what Ray was saying, that perhaps this Jewish dominance of the Nobel Prize may be fading or not, I don't know. So I'll stop there. Just to plug the book one more time. This is coming out Tuesday, but it's been available for pre-order on Amazon for a while now. And my publisher is actually running I don't know what you call it, a promotion. Normally, I would be doing book signings over the next several weeks. In fact, I'm doing a number of virtual book signings over the next couple of weeks, one at the Harvard bookstore and one at the Quail Ridge in Raleigh. But they have a promotion where if you send a proof of purchase, like from Amazon, to my assistant, who's Icy, whose email is shown here, yl703@duke.edu, or to me, we can then send that to the publisher, and you will get a book plate signed by me to paste in the book in lieu of my signing it. So that's something maybe of interest. I also highly recommend Ray's book on medal winners. I loved participating in that, in those interviews, and have read the book and recommend it very highly. And the last thing is, if you're interested in the Yellow Berets, there's a wonderful podcast, series of 4 podcasts that came out on Audible just a month or 2 ago. It totals about 2 hours spread over 4 podcasts. It's moderated by Alan Alda, and it includes interviews with 4 or 5 Yellow Berets telling their stories, etc. And that includes, once again, Tony Fauci, Joe Goldstein behind the yellow ribbon, myself, Harold Varmus, you've heard about all of us before, and this is Stanley Prusner, who won the Nobel Prize for his work in the discovery of prions. So I'll stop that. I'll stop at this point, and I guess we can have some discussion.
We'll say thank you very, very much. And Yasher Koach, it was wonderful hearing from both of you. We'll take about 10 minutes or so just for any questions. I'd like to encourage people to put them in the chat or to use the raise hand function. And if you do come off of mute, just to remember to ask a question and to limit your time so we can hear from both Bob and Ray. And the other thing I just want to offer the two of you is if there are any questions you want to ask each other, as well. But we'll just take, again, you can put a note in the chat if you have a question. I can't see everybody's screen, so you may have to use that raise hand function. But really a fascinating morning or a fascinating afternoon hearing from both of you, and a pleasure and honor to also claim part of that Bethel lineage in both of your families. So any I don't see anything from the chat yet. Any questions from people who are watching? this may be the quietest group of Jews that have gathered. Ah, yes, okay. So Kyra and Hal Hubis, go ahead and remove yourselves from mute and go ahead and start us off.
I have a question for Bob. Thank you very much for the discussion. I do have one question, which is somewhat of an important one as we turn off the phone. Are you right-handed or left-handed?
I'm right-handed.
Then I'm really astounded that a graduate of Bronx science and with the Yankees in the Bronx, you have your hands backwards on the baseball bat when you were 7.
Yes, I noticed that. I noticed that, but hopefully my form got better later on.
All right. Thank you. Thank you. Other questions or comments to share?
Well, I have one for Ray.
Rabbi.
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
Judy, go ahead.
Ray, I just wanted to say how important Ray was as a teenager in the synagogue and how much wonderful work he did. A chip off the old block, perhaps. But I was the religious school principal at the time. He was a teacher. He worked in the library, and he did the most vigorous Haftorah I think I've ever heard in the synagogue, Ray. It's so nice to see you again.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I was, my father took a sabbatical in London when I was 12. My sister Frances was 16. And so my preparation for my bar mitzvah was done by a rabbi in London who, as wonderful as Rabbi Berger was in Durham, there was a whole different level of training of the trup in London. And so I'm afraid that I hadn't lost that by the time I got back for my bar mitzvah.
Well, your teacher must have had a stentorian voice.
Ray, I would like to say that I am very grateful that that my religious school principal is not on this call reporting about my own behavior in religious school, which we'll leave for another time. Ed Halpern put a question in the chat that I think for you, Ray, and obviously both of you can answer. He says, you did not address the hypothesis that past Nobel winners tend to nominate their trainees for Nobel Prizes. Do you think there is any merit to the argument that Nobel Prizes are in part representative of this scientific networking?
Yeah, so this is, I'll start with the answer to this, and I would be fascinated to have Bob comment on this as kind of an insider to this process. Certainly, you can't win a Nobel Prize unless you've been nominated. And so the nomination process and letters of support are absolutely critical to the success. But of course, the selection is done for the physiology of medicine. It's done by the Karolinska Institute. So there's kind of an independent scientific body that reviews all the nominations that come in. It's kind of interesting. I mean, this question and the underside of this question, I discovered when I started looking at Jews and Nobel Prizes, it wouldn't surprise you in this audience that there are some anti-Semitic tropes that are found in on the internet around, the Jews. They've got this network, and it's all about how their success is part of being the inner circle. Of course, the Jews, at least early on, were never in the inner circle. But now enough have gone on to successful careers that has led to this kind of anti-Semitic thing that Jews have an unfair advantage, if you will, because of networking. I do think, Bob pointed out the fact that the lineages of a former training under a former Nobel Prize winner does increase your chances. I think that the generally accepted notion is not so much that introduces you into a network as you really learn how to do the top science from people who themselves have been top scientists. You're looking at really challenging questions. It takes a lot of bravery and courage to do that. And so training with someone has that, I think is sort of an inspiration in that regard. But Bob, I'd be interested in your response to that, to the extent that how important networking is in both the Nobel Prize as well as other recognitions in science.
I think as in all matters of this nature, it's complex. I think that the networking thing, or let's call it, I've known of some laureates who've actually campaigned for the award. I think in general, that is not something that is successful. But I know of several cases where it seems to have been, people who've done repeated sabbaticals at the Karolinska Institute year after year to raise their visibility there. But I think, frankly, those things are a real exception and a minor issue. An interesting thing is, and I did this at some point after I won the prize, they opened their archives 50 years hence. So you can look back and look at all the nominations that occurred in any given year up to 50 years ago. And so I did that in several fields, and it was really interesting. What you learn is that when you win the Nobel Prize, you weren't just nominated one time. You were repeatedly nominated. In fact, a typical thing would be somebody comes, here would be a typical scenario. Somebody is nominated for the Nobel Prize in a given year. They don't get it, I assure you. But the next year, or maybe a couple of years later, they're nominated again, but now they have 2 or 3 completely independent nominations. And then by the time 5 years has gone by, they might have 7 nominations. Typically, in the year they win, they have about 10 different completely independent nominations, okay? So whether or not one of those might have been a Nobel laureate or even their mentor, who knows? But typically in gaining a Nobel Prize, especially as you know, your data are certainly accurate, and in my case, they're right on the money. It was about 25 years after I made my key discoveries that I won the prize. But typically you just have, I'd say what I learned from my study of their archives is that when you win the prize, you've typically been in nomination for many years, typically 8 to 10, sometimes 20. And in the year you win, you've been typically nominated 10 times or more. It turns out that, as best I can tell, the guy who was nominated for the greatest number of years and by the greatest number of nominations, who never won the prize, was Sigmund Freud. He was nominated over a period of 25 years, in some years getting 20 nominations, and he never won. The other interesting thing is the overlap between medicine and chemistry, which obviously bears significantly on my prize. So a number of what are called, shall we say, hardcore chemists, inorganic chemists, synthetic chemists, whatever you want, medicinal chemists, hate the fact that in recent years, in about half the time, the Nobel Prize in Chemistry goes to somebody who's doing biochemistry, okay? And they squawk, and in the year that Kobilka and I won, there were some posts by, quote, the real chemists saying, oh my God, I can't. I remember there was one guy who was live blogging. I found out about this after the fact, was live blogging the countdown to the prize and talking about all his favorites and who was going to win and hoping they weren't going to give it to some life science biochemists again. And then he says an hour to go and he's babbling away, and then 10 minutes to go. And then the announcement comes and I'll never forget it, his blog reads, "Arg! Biochemists again," et cetera, et cetera. Something that was very gratifying to me personally was that when I was over for the prize in ceremonies, we were having dinner, I think the first night, with the Nobel Prize Committee in Chemistry. And he was telling us that there's a lot of interchange between the medicine and the chemistry committees. They talk to each other. They know who they're considering, etc. And he said to Brian and myself, with a big smile on his face, he says, you know, there was a real tug of war between medicine and us in chemistry as to who was going to give you the prize this year, and we won. So I thought, I don't know, maybe it was apocryphal, but needless to say, that was kind of thrilling to hear that.
Thank you both. I'll throw one other comment that was put into the chat that maybe you can address. You know, obviously on the charts that were shared, and you know, there were very, very few women from this time period, and somebody commented, just sort of said, I wonder what it's going to look like in 20, 30, 40 years, or, you know, 10, 20, 30 years. You know, and I would love just to hear your, you know, any reflections on how that's going to shift and change.
So I'll start, and Bob, you can chime in. You know, one of the things is just how dramatically the feeding pipeline has changed over the course of the lifetime of myself and Bob. Tony Fauci talked about when he got into the program, the military recruiter came to his senior medical school class at Cornell, of which I think there were around 80 students in that class. There were 4 women in the class. I mean, he was talking to the men because they were the ones that were subject to the military draft. So at the time, and I think this was not atypical, Bob, I don't know how many women were in your class, but 4 out of the medical school class were women, and this was 1966 graduating class. By the time I got to medical school at Duke, about 1/3 of my class was women. Today, there are more female medical students than there are males, by a small margin. And you start looking across the sciences, that's increasingly true in the sciences as well. So if you look at the lag time, if you adjust for the lag time, I think we're going to see a wave of women, you know, starting probably 15, 20 years down the road. The people that are coming into the fields in the last 15 years are going to be at the stage of their careers when they're more likely to win Nobels. I think despite all the challenges of being a woman in science, women are taking the lead in many fields, and I expect it will be some time, but I think we'll see it in the Nobel Prize recipients as well. Bob?
I completely endorse all of Ray's remarks, which mirror my own experience. I graduated medical school in 1966. There were 110 in my class. There were 8 women. I know for a fact that 4 years before, in 1962, the class of the same size had only 4 women. Just as you say, Ray, at Duke today, our medical school class is 56% women. Now, when I was in medical school, there were no women in positions such as chair or dean or anything like that. But let's look at Duke today. The dean of Duke Medical School is a woman. Her predecessor was a woman. The chairman of the Department of Medicine is a woman. The chairman of pediatrics is a woman. The chairman of psychiatry is a woman. I could go on and on. So there's been a complete, change. It's been an evolution. It was not a revolution. It's taken decades for this to happen. And there's no doubt that there have been terrible oversights through the years by the Nobel Committee back in the day. I mean, I mentioned Lisa Meitner in physics, who should have shared a Nobel Prize. Now, Roz Franklin, the one from whom Watson and Crick essentially lifted or pilfered the key X-ray diffraction film that led to the solving of the structure of DNA. She had died by the time they won the Nobel Prize, but I suspect if she was alive, she would not have shared it. So there were many such injustices over the years, but this is changing. And of course, we had people like Marie Curie, who won one of 5 people to ever win 2 prizes. But I do think that as women, move deeper and deeper into these positions of authority and equality, that we will see more and more female winners. Of course, we just had Jennifer Doudna this year, who's a good friend of mine, I'm pleased to say, and who gave the Lefkowitz lecture a year before her Nobel Prize. I like to think that's a harbinger of good things. She won. In fact, she shared the prize, I forget the woman's name, but with another woman. So yes, I think everything Ray says is true. I think, thankfully, a lot of this has changed.
Rabbi, there was a question Ben Lipson asked about, did I personally encounter anti-Semitism at the University of Texas, which is a little off of the main theme here, but the answer to that was no. In fact, the person who occupied the position that I did before me was a fellow by the name of Ken Shine, who was the president of the Institute of Medicine before he took the job in Texas, a sort of national prestigious honorary elective society. So I didn't overtly, but I must say there was only, of the 6 campuses, health campuses that I was responsible for, only one of them had a Jewish president, Dan Podolsky, at Texas Southwestern in Dallas. So I don't think there wasn't anything overt. Probably a more interesting story, and I didn't experience it either at the Medical University of South Carolina, where I was the first Jewish president there. But it was fascinating in the Charleston Jewish community. When I became president, so many people kind of came out of the woodwork to tell me that there had been a Jewish quota in place when they went to medical school. There were, I forget what the limits were, but a handful of Jewish students each year. This is now a generation or two earlier. So by the time I got there, I didn't really experience it, at least overtly, but we're not that far removed from when Jews had very limited opportunities in a lot of academic institutions.
This is really true. I mean, my generation experienced very, very little anti-Semitism. The generation before me, tremendous amount. And in fact, most medical, I don't know if that's fair, many medical schools had quotas for Jews. I applied to 5 medical schools, all top places, and I got into 4 of them. The only one I didn't get into was Cornell, okay? Subsequently, about 20 years later, I read an article in the New York Times. Somebody was doing a study, and they said that Cornell Medical School had a quota for Jews up until whenever, long past when I had applied. That was kind of interesting to me. But yeah, I encountered, other than that, I was never aware of any overt anti-Semitism that I experienced. And of course, our very own Ralph Snyderman was the CEO of Duke for 15 years. And his second in command at one point, Mark Rogers, was another Jew and a Bronx High School of Science alum. So, yeah.
And I will just note, in addition, also Ed Halpern is on this call, and wonderful medical historian who's done a lot of research and writing regarding this topic. I don't know if he wants to add anything to what's just been shared, and I certainly don't want to put him on the spot.
Dr.
Please.
Well, Dr. Lefkowitz is quite right. The New York City Council conducted public hearings on the quota system of the New York medical schools. And Cornell's director of admissions admitted under oath that all Jewish applicants were segregated from non-Jewish applicants, were considered differently, and that Cornell attempted to only admit Jews, in their view, in proportion to the national population. And he seemed to be, this was quite appropriate. It never seemed to have occurred to him that this national population never applied to women or Blacks, for example, but was only used as a means to deny Jews admission to Cornell. The standard joke for what Dr. Lefkowitz said is the generation of Jewish physicians who believe the correct way to pronounce the name of that medical school on the Upper East Side of Manhattan is Cornell.
And with that, I want to say a tremendous thank you to Dr. Ray Greenberg. And to Ray, I want to say it's really nice to meet you. I really feel honored. And while your mom, may she live to 120, and while she's not living in this area anymore, we once the coronavirus, God willing, very soon calms down and we're able to be in person. The door is always open. We'd love to show you the new building. We'd love to welcome you with challah and kiddush and aliyah, and just welcome you back to Bethel. But we are so grateful that you shared what you did today, and congratulations on the wonderful book. And we put into the chat many opportunities.
All right, so that's the end of the recording. I have it saved, so if you want a copy of it to send to people or to watch again, I can email it or put it in the weekly email. But that's it, unless anyone has any comments they want to share or anything.
I thought it was really, really interesting. Thanks for bringing it to us.
Yeah, thanks for having it for us. It's really interesting. And as an alum of Bronx science, I'm right with it.
Yeah. I just wanted to know what he's spending the money on. The prize is like $50,000.
Oh.
So nobody asked that question.
Oh. Yeah.
I'd just like to add, you wonder if the name Francis Seller Collins might one day appear on a Nobel, something like that. Very, very much involved, I think, in the research of figuring out what the cystic fibrosis gene was in Ann Arbor before he went to the NIH. And I think it was he and Guttmacher who really untangled a lot of the human genome. And what was it, the year 2000, both their pictures on the front of Time magazine. And I've been a little surprised. Francis Seller Collins is actually class of 77 at Chapel Hill, which is a year ahead of me. And so I remember seeing this sort of lanky, almost sleepy-eyed medical student plying the halls at North Carolina Memorial Hospital when I was a third and a fourth year student, and then he would have been a fourth year student. He did his internship and residency. I think he was the chief resident in medicine at Chapel Hill where he finished up, and then did so many wonderful things. So be interesting to see what happens. You know, unfortunately, he's sort of cast more, I guess, in kind of a politician in this tug of war that you've seen with some of our presidents, past and present or whatever. And I'm sure he's uncomfortable. He'd rather be kind of right in the middle of the action at the NIH. Thanks so much for the opportunity to comment. Great presentation, by the way, from Bethel.
Yeah. All right, well, thank you all for coming. Have a nice evening.
Julie.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.